everyone, I'm Marissa Rivera. I'm on the Board of Directors of Austin Connection.
And I'm Anastasia McAteer, another board member.
We are so excited to bring our guests that we have with us this evening. But first we need to tell you a little bit about Austin Connection. So Austin Connection was founded in 2007 by a group of therapists who were really passionate about bringing more understanding and learning about interpersonal neurobiology and relationship science to both the public and other clinicians. Since then, we've really continued to grow here in Austin, and we host events all the time for both the public and clinicians. We just had an event focused on couples. We brought in Dr. Bruce Atkinson from Chicago and had a really great live discussion with a few couples therapists in town. We have more coming up, namely in February we will have Payne Bryson and Dr. Scott LePor with us in Austin, Texas. Anastasia, you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
So it's February 22nd, and we'll be talking from an attachment lens, talking from both their experience with their work. And it's going to be geared towards the public specifically, and we want to reach as much, a large range of the population. So we're actually going to even donate some tickets to nonprofits to have teen moms and other people to join, in addition to anyone else who wants to buy a ticket.
Yeah, so you'll be hearing much more about that in the coming months. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and bring on our guest. So we have Dr. Payne Bryson. She's a New York Times best-selling author. You might know her books, The Yes Brain, The Whole Brain Child, and No Drama Discipline. She's also the founder and executive director of the Center for Connection in Pasadena, California, and she's with us here in Austin, Texas today. We also have Dr. Scott LePor. He is the medical director for the Texas Juvenile Justice Department and is doing some amazing work there and really beginning to shake some things up. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring them on.
All right.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be joining you on a Sunday evening. Hope you're in your pajamas. We are both sick tonight, so we were sort of wishing we could do the event in our jammies.
Welcome to Austin. We've got pollen.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, we're really excited to have y'all here. I think what I really want to start with is how y'all got connected and kind of helping walk us through how your work is bridged and how it crosses over.
Go ahead.
Yes. So I'll go back, I guess.
Yeah, please.
To where it started for me, and if it wasn't for Tina's work, it certainly wouldn't have progressed to where it is today. So my wife and I are both physicians. We came to a point in our life where we had our biological daughter. My wife decided to retire, so we had always talked about fostering, adopting. We had the resources and the time, so we started to foster. And the first child that came to our home was approached by an agency that she was coming from a home where she was, the biological parents, the foster parents were fearing for their biological children. So it was a very difficult case. And so they said, you guys are both physicians, you're both medically trained. Will you take this child? And we did. So everything that we tried with a medical model failed. And so my wife had read The Connected Child. She said, Scott, we need to go back to this. I think this is worth the effort. And so we started to apply the principles of The Connected Child, and we saw amazing connection, amazing change. So I applied for a scholarship, went for training to become a practitioner in trust-based relational intervention, which is this model that falls within interpersonal neurobiology, and then went back and became an educator. Started to teach organizations, other healthcare professionals. We started to use a model actually within a hospital setting for patient experience. I started to use it in my practice for youth and then also for adult medicating. So then understanding too Brene Brown's work of empathy, vulnerability, seeing that, man, this interpersonal neurobiology is really optimal relationships for all people, all ages, all relationships. So this is where it started to grow. I started to help other states, organizations. One thing that impacted me the most is that with TBRI, we talked about principles of connection, empowering, connecting, and then how to guide behavior later on. One thing that was pivotal is when I started to read your work. So what No Drama Discipline did for me, The Whole Brain Child, and then The Yes Brain, and that's the order I read them in, it gave me that visualization to what does that look like in practice. So because of my own attachment style, I didn't know what some of those look like. So what I don't know, I don't know. So I was told what high structure, high nurture model, but I really didn't have the capacity to visualize what that was. So when I read your work with Dan's work, it was just so impactful and powerful, and then really had the efficacy just explode because I knew what that looked like. And then I could start to be intentional and work that through. So I reached out to you just thanking you for your work and gratefulness, and then we started to connect in that capacity.
Yeah, like-minded people, you know, it's fun, that connection. And when I heard what you were doing, I'm so excited about the work you're doing here in the state of Texas to help. You know, I think one of the big things that Dan Siegel and I really wanted to do in No Drama Discipline was to say, look, a lot of times the way we see kids' behaviors and the way we respond to them are counterproductive. We're missing something really important, and it's this whole piece of regulation. And I'm a big Stephen Porges fan, and thinking about sort of the idea of safety first, and how when we have a neuroception that is communicating threat or danger, we can't be regulated in those moments. And so anyway, I think, you know, Dan and I really want people to understand that behavior is communication, and often communication of dysregulation, and that there are skills that need to be built. And so I'm just so touched to get to be working and collaborating with you, because you're doing that here in the state of Texas to help in this juvenile justice department rethink behaviors and rethink the response to behavior, and how oftentimes when we don't have a trauma-informed lens, when we're not thinking about regulation and the power of relationships to build regulation and to support that safety, we can often traumatize more and do more harm.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's really exciting.
Yes.
That you're doing that work.
Well, and so I have a very small part, but so for people that the Texas Juvenile Justice Department has had kind of not the best of past, and so Camille Kane, who is the executive director, was commissioned to come in and kind of clean it up. And so she was exposed to a model, Williamson County, that was heavy with TBRI. So she saw the outcome, and so knew that this is the model that she wanted. So she brought in a bunch of wonderful people. One of the most important that I believe, and probably because I work with her so much, but Chandra Carter, who understands interpersonal neurobiology to the core. She has worked at TCU and Institute of Child Development, knows TBRI in and out. So when these people, so they started to bring people in that knew this lens, and that's how I connected with her. I had come to testify to state legislators last November. I had to give a talk at TCU that night, so I was scheduled to go first with Chandra. So that's how we met. Then their medical director retired, we were aligned. And so the opportunity to do this full time is like it was a no-brainer.
I think I'm a big fan of the TBRI model, and I think what's interesting is, you know, you got attracted to this because you were trying to find something effective with your child. And I think, you know, what's so powerful about IPNB and about this work that we're all really invested in is that it matters a lot for all of our relationships, no matter if it's you and your significant other, or you and your child, or you and your own parent, even as adults. And I think this idea of where I think it cuts across all of these things when we really look at sort of the core of interpersonal neurobiology, I think what we're often really looking at is the idea of, and I love this so much, one of the clinicians that works with me at the Center for Connection, we were talking about this idea of communicating sort of three things. And as she and I were talking about it, I thought, oh, that maps right onto the triune brain too. And the three things are the idea of you are safe. So there's brainstem and our whole nervous system, our embodied brain. The second one is I'm with you, and that's the attachment piece, right? That of course supports safety, and that's more limbic and below. And then the last part is so you're safe, I'm with you, let's figure this out together. And then we can move into that more cortical and prefrontal part where we can do some problem solving, but it has to happen in that order. You know that
Yes.
you are
Yeah.
safe. I'm with you. Those are very intertwined, but it's so important.
Yeah, so before we go on, and I love seeing how much crossover y'all have, and I feel like this is such like an Austin experience. Y'all talking about the way you started collaborating.
We just need some barbecue and some
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's magic. Can you break down for folks out there what TBRI stands for and IPNB and how that kind of crosses over? So if you could just kind of spell out those acronyms and
Good idea.
talk a little bit about that.
Yes. And in essence, so we'll use different words and maybe different principles, but it's all the same. So like the 4 S's. But so the trust-based relational intervention. So I love that. So that felt safety, that trust must come first. And so this is where, so we could go off in so many directions with this, but it's really a caregiver model. And this is what we keep going over, and this is the roadblock within an agency like Texas Juvenile Justice Department. Because it's not a model that I can take and then impose on kids to change behavior, I must really change and understand who I am before I can safely connect. And I must be
Right.
aware of myself, my own attachment. And so in trust-based relational intervention, it's all about how I learn about myself that I can connect with my child. So the science shows us that my attachment style becomes the attachment style of the child and blended with any other caregiver. But even how that my child reacts to me is dependent upon my attachment style. So in the model that we use at home, like my wife and I spend most of our time changing us so that our children behavior and regulation can be scaffolded by what we do. And so this is that complexity of it's not not another parenting toolbox. It's the science of how we can truly structure a child's brain to become that strong prefrontal cortex, and it's all built upon trust. So that felt safety and trust is pivotal, and then how I am and how I connect with them is what breeds about that capability, including vulnerability and empathy, so that mindfulness and mindsight, which you and Dan have coined. So the principles are also then empowering, so I meet the child's needs. Ecologically, physiologically, when I meet someone's needs, that builds trust. And then when I connect with them in a safe way, safe nurturing way, in a mindful way, then and only then science shows that I can start to guide behavior, truly from the inside out. So then I'm actually modeling the behavior, and then the brain of the child starts to model the behavior from the inside out. So yes, if I'm authoritarian, I can change your behavior now, but it's not really encompassing within the brain of the child, so that later on they'll go do what they've always wanted to do. So it's just taking control or captive of the child. So TBRI is all of that high investment, high yield, high structure, high nurture model. And I think the difficulty even for myself was reading through this in any area that I wasn't exposed to it as a child. I really didn't know exactly what that looked like. And so once I started especially reading your work, was, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I could parent that way. And how beautiful that is, and how difficult it is. So there's a lot of areas that my brain resists, but the more I did it, the more I saw the outcome, the more I was bought in, and then the more intentional I become, because you see the benefit of the outcome, not only for myself and fulfillment, but then for the child as well, and how we connect.
Yeah, I think, we know the brain gets wired from experiences, so the more reps we get, sort of like lifting weights, the more reps we get with practicing and parenting this way, the easier it becomes how our brains get wired. So back to your question about interpersonal neurobiology, just in case we have some people who aren't up to knowing what that is. It's really sort of an umbrella or a framework for us to understand reality and to understand science. So instead of just having a neuroscience lens or just having a psychology lens, for example, we pull those together, and we really are looking at how the mind and the brain and relationships all interact to shape who we are. That's sort of the main framework. And the guiding principle around interpersonal neurobiology is guided by this science from complexity theory or dynamic systems theory that looks at how when a system is integrated, and let me define that, integration is really where separate, differentiated parts are honored for their differences in the jobs that they're doing, but they're also functionally linked. So you're the doctor here, but my favorite analogy around this is the different organs of our body. They're all specialized to do a specific job, but if they are not also functionally linked to each other, we don't have health, and that's really how any system is. So when we talk about integration in the interpersonal neurobiology lens, we're talking about how differentiated parts are functionally linked, and when that happens, the system is, the acronym is FACES. Dan and I always love acronyms. And that stands for being able to be flexible, adaptive, coherent, meaning we do what makes sense, energized, and stable. So when, let's say we'll talk about the system of my individual brain, when the differentiated parts of my brain are working together. So for example, my frontal lobe that helps me regulate my body and make good decisions is developed and linked with my more reactive limbic and brainstem impulses. I'm able to maybe pause before I say something hurtful or something like that. So it allows me in that moment to be more flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable, instead of what reflects disintegration, chaos, rigidity, or both. So these are really, I think for me, when I talk about, that's a lot of science and it's interesting, but I think the key is to think about how we harness neuroplasticity, how we really think about how the brain changes, particularly from the experiences we have in relationships. So when I really think about IPNB, I'm always thinking about regulation, relationships. Those are the two really big key features, and then we get to geek out on all the science that helps us think about those in deeper ways.
Well, let's geek out about that. So, Tina, you have a new book coming out in January 2020, which we're super pumped about. It's called The Power of Showing Up.
Yes.
And I know that the Austin and Connection members, we got an exclusive preview of that book. Thank you for that.
Yes.
In that first chapter, one of the things that you did talk about is how showing up and these 4 S's affect the physical architecture of the brain. Can you get a little nerdy about that? Because we had some questions about that.
Yeah, so this book co-authored with Dan Siegel. I'm so excited about this book. You know, every time we have a book, it's like a baby. You can't really choose like which one you love the most, but I feel like this one is so important. It's actually, when we wrote The Whole Brain Child, this is like a little story, but when we wrote The Whole Brain Child, at the end, we had this whole section in the conclusion. It was this really long conclusion. And we basically were saying, like, the most important thing you need to know is, and our editors were like, you're kind of discounting all the other important stuff. Can we pull that out? Could that be maybe a book down the road? And that's really what this book is. And it's really based on the longitudinal research that shows that one of the best predictors for how we turn out, even based on multiple things we can think of to measure outcomes on, one of the best predictors is that we have had secure attachment with at least one person. And let me just break that down a little bit. Attachment is an inborn organizational system that we have as mammals, and at its core, it's the idea that when we are in distress, where we detect threat, we're upset, we're in pain, we're afraid, that we go to an attachment figure who will, when we get close to them, it actually regulates our physiological states. So you think about like a chimpanzee in the jungle, here's a scary, tiger growl. They run to another chimp who basically is like, I've got you, I will keep you safe. And so then the chimp's little heart rate slows down, and all the whole physiological reactivity of a threat state going into fight, flight, freeze, or faint can get back into a regulated physiological state. So when we have secure attachment, where we have someone who helps us have that kind of regulation, it changes how our brain gets wired. So Dan and I love to talk about secure attachment in the way of talking about the 4 S's. So let me just say those really quickly. Safe, so feeling physically safe, and we can talk specifics about what that means for parents, like for sure, first do no harm, like we shouldn't terrorize our children or terrify them, or be physically harmful to them. Seen, that's the idea of someone really understanding you, and where you feel like you are known, where you feel felt, someone understands your internal world. Soothed, so I guess those are really actually what I started with, like the you're safe, I'm with you, we're sort of already back to that. But soothed is basically where someone's like, I'm going to help you calm down, I'm here for you, I'm going to help you feel okay again. And then over time, when we have not perfect but repeated, predictable enough experiences of feeling safe, seen, and soothed, someone really showing up for us, our brain actually wires with a mental model to expect that when we're in distress, when we have a need, someone will see it and show up for us. And our brains actually wire in that way, so it influences the kinds of friendships we choose, the kinds of mates we choose. And I think this book is so important because, you know, one of the things that Dan and I were talking about is, you know, at a time in our history where, you know, we talk about Dan always coming up with the acronyms and things. Dan was talking about the 4 Ds, which is the devastation of school violence and sort of the violence in our world, and the despair of feeling like we don't belong to each other, and how loneliness is such an epidemic, the distraction of our devices and our overscheduled lives, and finally the despair of our political climate or even our actual planet, you know, struggling in terms of its wellness. And so, you know, it's like, what do we tell our kids? What do we say? What's the answer when we sit with the heaviness of all of that? And the idea is that, you know, we may not be able to fix all of that immediately, but we can always show up for each other. And so, particularly for parents who are hyper parenting, who think they have to do everything for their kids and all this stuff, it's to say, you don't have to do all that. Really, your presence, showing up, is the most important thing you need to do. And then for the parents who are overscheduled and distracted and have their own limitations in terms of even their own self-care, so it's hard for them to show up for their kids, to say, your kids really need, you know, our kids really need that from us. So I'm excited about this book. We have always we give really practical tips, but these 4 S's are powerful. And just like Scott said, you know, we can't provide experiences for our kids that we don't have the capacity for ourselves. So of course, an important part of the book is to talk about our own 4 S's. And did our parents help us feel safe and seen and soothed, or did they not? And in what ways did they or did not? And to really start shining the light of awareness and reflection on some of those pieces, so that we can provide some intentionality about providing those experiences for our kids, and a lot of grace, so that when we don't, I was giving a talk on the book recently, and I said, when should you provide the 4 S's? And I said, always. You should always provide the 4 S's. And then my very next bullet point was, you can't provide the 4 S's all the time, right? So the beauty of this research, too, is it's so hopeful, because it's saying, you didn't have to have grown up this way to be able to do it for your kids, as long as you start reflecting on it and make sense of it and work on that coherent narrative around it. But the second piece of it is that as soon as we start changing, our kids start changing for the better too, in terms of how their brains get wired. And I missed your last part of your question, which is about how the physical architecture changes. And we know that where attention goes, neurons fire, and where neurons fire, they wire. So what we give attention to, like, for instance, my child is pouting and being kind of oppositional in that moment, you know, I can give attention to the behavior only and say, you can't act like that, which is kind of a funny thing to say, because they already are acting that way, right? I can't, like, the whole idea of controlling a child is actually, if you've ever tried to force a child to go to the bathroom or fall asleep or eat something, you know, you truly don't have control over another human being. But really in that moment, if my attention goes to my child's internal landscape, like, I'm noticing that you're having a really hard time right now, what's going on? And then we can kind of sit in that for a moment. My kid feels safe enough to say, I feel embarrassed, or something like that, as opposed to him being a brat. It allows the brain to kind of then make the connection of his physiological state to the emotion of embarrassed, and then my mom shows up for me, I calm down. The brain actually starts making different neural connections. And I think the last piece of this, and then I'll pause, is to say that, you know, I think there's a lot of fear that as parents, if we help our kids feel safe, seen, and soothed, we're coddling them, we're making them spoiled, we make them reliant on us, the world won't be like that. But we know really that it's the experiences we have that have a huge impact on how the brain gets wired. And if, with my support, particularly when my kids are developing over time, they go from a disintegrated state, dysregulated state, where their behavior looks kind of awful, and if I show up for them and help them get regulated again, it's for sure it makes things easier, rather than have the big, long, blown-out fight. But what happens is my child has an experience of going from a dysregulated state back into a regulated state with my support and help. and then his brain learns how to do that for himself. He gets a rep, sort of like lifting that muscle.
And you're kind of segueing us to one of the other questions that we got, and maybe Scott, you can speak a little bit to this, particularly because you're really working at, as part of your job, you're working at that intersection of mental health, physical health, and the judicial system and law enforcement. So one of the questions that we got from our members is, how do you talk to folks who say that these approaches to parenting don't prepare kids for the real world? So essentially what you said about coddling, but how do you actually talk to those folks that aren't quite bought into this and actually see it as maybe harmful?
So, so one thing too, and this kind of segues to what you were saying, but that, and the science shows that resiliency, true resiliency, not callousness, so those are different. And we can kind of look at them and maybe use resiliency sometimes to callousness, which is someone has been hardened so much that they still succeed in life, depending on your definition of being successful, but they can't establish secure relationships. And we know that's where fulfillment comes from. So that's what the studies have shown as well. So really, that Harvard study that went on for 80 years, right? So it doesn't. The bottom line of all this data was that the more trust-based relationships you had, the more fulfilled you were, period. So it didn't matter how much money you made, what job you had, what difficulties you went through, but it's connection. So if I lack the ability to connect, I don't have true resiliency. I can't get through life through the difficulties. And so the point I wanted to make too, which connects with this, is exactly what you're saying. So the attachment cycle is this, is that it never ends throughout life, but I'll use a baby. So when a baby cries and it's hungry, excitatory neurotransmitters, sympathetic pathway, and so that baby's in distress, I'm acknowledging my distress. When a mother comes or a caregiver comes in a nurturing way and meets that need, then you get that parasympathetic nervous system, calming neurotransmitters, wiring together, scaffolding that brain so that it can do that same, I can meet my own need in the future. So that's building that resiliency. But I want to make the point that it all starts with a difficulty. So it's not about removing difficulties for my child. Now, in the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, we talk about traumas and adverse childhood experiences. We do want to remove traumas as much as we can. But difficulties are the foundation for trust. So when I have a need and someone meets it in a nurturing way, that establishes that connection, that trust between us. And so it's that grain of sand that eludes later to the pearl. So it's not about removing difficulties. And it does breed resiliency, so the science is clear on that.
Yeah.
But I also do want to make that point that it's built on difficulties, because with fostering, right, when we had our difficult child, I remember just praying, dear God, give us one day without difficulties, right? So I was looking for no difficulty. So once I understood the science, oh my word, that's my opportunity for connection. That's my opportunity to change the child. Bring it on. Now, I didn't have to pray for difficulties. They happened, right? But I knew that it was the difficulty, and then it actually changed how I responded to the difficulty. So before, it was I didn't want it, and it was a distraction in my day, and now I was looking for it. Here's my opportunity. I can connect with this child, and that's what started to change the brain of the child.
Well, and I think the big difference between toxic stress and tolerable stress is connection, is that idea of having someone show up for you. And you're right, parents are concerned about their kids not being resilient. And I think the idea is, what I say to parents all the time is, if you want your child to be resilient, you have to give them practice dealing with difficult things, right? And so when we deprive kids from the struggle without support, they don't build those sort of muscles. And I think this is so important to really think about this idea of boundary setting and connection as different dimensions, okay? So, I studied my dissertation on this. You already talked about authoritative versus authoritarian permissive parenting, in which most people are familiar with those terms. But the science is really clear that having high expectations, firm boundaries, predictable sort of expectations is really good for kids. It helps them feel safe. But they also need high warmth, high sensitivity, high connection. That the combination is what is key in terms of the best outcome. So I would love to tell like a little personal story about how to do that. How do you have good boundaries where you're not just, because here's the thing, you can't spoil a child by providing connection and warmth and sensitivity and love. And touching them and holding them. You can't spoil them. Where we can, and I don't even like the word spoiled, but where we can sort of deprive kids of stuff that they need is where we where we don't have boundaries or expectations, where anything goes, or if they whine long enough, we give in, those kinds of things. So the way we think about this is this, in the research they call it orthogonal dimensions. So you've got, one that goes this way and the one that goes that way. So you can be high on warmth and nurturing and connection, or low on it. You can be high on demands or control, or I don't like those words. I like expectations and boundaries. And where you fall on both those dimensions determines that authoritative, authoritarian, permissive neglect. So my son was about 5 at the time, and I have 3 boys, and this is my youngest. I've had a lot of practice by this time, and my brain has had a lot of reps of staying regulated myself first, because I've had parents say, like, they need to respect me, and if I'm not, yelling, they won't respect me. And I'm thinking, actually, kids really respect people who are in control of their emotions instead of out of control. So anyway, I've had a lot of practice by this time, not that I don't still mess up, but in this moment, my son is completely dysregulated. It's late at night, but he's so filthy. Normally I would just be like, fine, don't worry about the bath, but he's so disgusting. I'm like, you have to take a bath. So he's totally exhausted, falling apart, doesn't want to get into the bath. It's a big battle to get him into the bath. Once I get him in the bath, then it's going to be a big battle to get him out. You would know how this works, yes. Right? So he's got this whole thing about this one particular Lego guy he wants in the tub with him, and it's just this big complex thing. I won't go into the whole story. But ultimately, I know that my number one most important thing is to stay regulated myself. Then I've got this boundary, like, it's time for bed. And I'm really militant about sleep in my family, because I actually think one of the biggest things that's playing into the mental health crisis that we have now, and being in disintegrated states, is sleep. Kids are so sleep deprived. But anyway, that's a whole other talk. But anyway, so JP is my little guy, and he's in the tub, and I say, hey, it's going to be time to get out in a couple of minutes. And then, he falls apart again, and he's crying and yelling. And so it's time, and I say, okay, it's time to get out. Either you can get yourself out, or as gently as I can, which I'm telling myself to remember to be gentle with his body, as gently as I can, I'm going to help you out. And as I'm pulling him out of the tub, enforcing the boundary of it's time to get out, as I'm pulling him out of the tub, he's screaming and yelling, and I'm saying with a calm voice, I know you're so disappointed about getting out of the bathtub. You really wanted to stay in. It's so sad that you have to get out. As I'm lifting his body out. And I say to him, you can cry and yell if you need to. I'm right here with you while you're upset. So this is how we, I'm enforcing a boundary, but he's feeling like his internal experience and my response to it are a match. And when we provide empathy like that, where, like, if he's upset and I say, what are you so upset about? There's nothing to be that upset about. Or the kid's like, I'm afraid there's monsters. Like, there's nothing to be afraid of. If we say things like that, where our response to the child's internal experience are not a match, it actually keeps them in that heightened state of dysregulation or nervous system arousal. So empathy is one of the most effective things to kind of down-regulate that reactivity. So in that moment, I was able to help him feel felt while I was enforcing the boundary.
Yes. And I feel like you must be reading the comments. I know you can't see them from there, but somebody just asked a question about that. Is like, what do I do with my kiddo when I lean in for connection, I get anger, I get aggression? And I'm assuming, Scott, that this is something that happens a lot too in the juvenile justice department, right? Kiddos who have never had that experience and tend to get really activated very easily. The connection
may even be dysregulating.
Yes. And that's where mindfulness comes in. So being aware of where someone else is. And then also experiential avoidance. So then I'm not going to get taken into by your dysregulation, but I'm here for you, but also mindful, because then my connection can be seen as intrusive, and I can cause you to become more dysregulated. So I need to be aware of where that person is at. And then, like, with the child too, you may be more the caregiver, so that could be more difficult if you do have to stay in the engagement.
Yeah.
But what I tell parents all the time, and this is what I get, especially when culturally we have a lot of authoritative seeing this as permissive, and those that are permissive see this as authoritative, and then I'm sorry, authoritarian, but it's because the authoritative really isn't in the brain, and so they don't know what that looks like. And so what I get a lot of is, when do I wear that structure hat? When do I wear that nurture hat? And I'm like, you're wearing both hats always.
All the time.
And so you may have to lean a little bit more into a structure or more into a nurture. And one of the most impactful things that I saw visually and then heard, it was Karen Purvis. And in a training I was at, they showed Karen being very structured with one of the youth and bringing her into regulation. And then they showed the same, and I thought, wow, Karen was a little stiff with that, and maybe even a little more structure than I was comfortable with. Well, then they replayed the clip again, but no visualization. It's blank screen, and you hear the audio. And her voice was so gentle and kind. And so it impacted me, and that's a talent, right? I mean, that's learned intentionally. But that impacted me, knowing that, my gosh, that's where I want to be, so that in those difficult times where I need that a strong nurture and structure, can I have that within me to help that child?
Yeah, it's really important, and it's really hard to do. And, you know, we're going to mess up all the time.
Right.
As parents, you know. Those dysregulated states are contagious, because we're held captive to one another's nervous systems, right? And if you're really attuned, and you know, I think in that moment, if I got frustrated too, and I ended up yelling at JP, then you know that's okay. Then as soon as I'm regulated again, I can go back to him and say, "I'm so sorry. I wish I had handled that differently. I had a scary voice. I'm sure that didn't feel good." And you make that repair. I think the other thing too is to think about how, you know, our kids are going to give us lots of opportunities, right, to mess up and to try to make it right. But I think, you know, this idea of really being present to what's going on. I have parents who ask me all the time, like, I try to connect with my kid and like they'll push me away. And I say, look, it really is about attunement. It really is about trying to tune into your child's experience and meet their need, as opposed to maybe your need to feel better about, I tried to connect, right? And so it's really about that. And so like I'll tell parents, like, please don't chase your child and be like, I'm going to connect with you, I'm going to give you empathy. Like, that's not attuned, right? And honestly, I mean, all of us have different preferences. Sometimes when I'm upset, I actually would prefer to be alone. I'm not ready yet to connect with someone. I need to have some time. And so what I encourage parents to do then is to say, to make yourself available and present, but not intrusive. So, you know, let's say your kid goes to their room, they slam the door and they're like, I don't want to talk to you. We can say, you know, I'm here, let me know if you need something. I'll come back and check on you in a few minutes. So then you're making yourself available and present, but you're also respecting what's going on. I know not everybody agrees with me. Some people think that you should say I love you too much to let you be this upset alone and to stay. I just really feel like for most kids, tuning into their state, making yourself available and present, and then coming back to check on them can be really powerful.
Yes.
But I think that also kind of reinforces a child's agency to consent too. Like, I need space.
Yeah.
This is what I need, and their ability to communicate with you. I love that.
Yeah, and you can have a reflective dialogue with them about that. To say, I noticed earlier, you know, I wanted to hug you and you know, talk to you, but you really wanted to be alone. Tell me about that. What is that like for you when you're alone? How does that help you? And you kind of help them have some insight around that. You're giving them some good prefrontal practice when you're doing that too.
So, just for everybody watching out there, just to let y'all know that this will be available on the Facebook page for the next 24 hours. So, if you're trying to figure out what an acronym was or any other information that y'all have said, know that you're going to be able to replay this. And for Austin and Connection members, this will be uploaded to our member portal. So, you'll have access for this for beyond the 24 hours. Can y'all talk a little bit about what you're going to be sharing with us in February? So on February 22nd, you'll be here in Austin, and Tina, you'll be returning to Austin to do an event with Austin Connection at the O4 Center, right in South Austin, right in the heart of South Austin. Talk to us a little bit about what it is that y'all are going to be talking about during the workshop, and what we can look forward to.
I think primarily we'll be talking about relationships, regulation, attachment. I think it'd be really fun for us to geek out a little bit on even the neurophysiology of what regulation looks like and what's happening in the nervous system, and to talk about states of arousal and how those are connected to different attachment interactions.
Yes.
Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, and I think it'll be a more organized pattern to what we're talking about tonight.
We're just hanging out tonight.
Yes. So hitting on topics with so many things coming to
Yeah.
my mind, epigenetics and then temperament, and then so how to best dance with each child through these difficulties. But in an organized fashion, and then so we had thought that I would probably talk more from that TBRI lens of my experience. But in essence, in all these models, so especially with Texas Juvenile Justice, so we were talking about this crisis stabilization unit that we are developing, and it is for those that really have mental dysregulation from a very traumatic past. And so now we talk about therapeutic models, we talk about TBRI, we talk about interpersonal neurobiology. All of it comes down to connection. And then even within in the models themselves, it all must be on felt safety, attunement, mindfulness. So really, even though we have different lenses and we're using it in different capacities and even in different relationships, like it's all the same.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that in all this, it really is all about connection. And we really die if we don't have it.
Yeah,
Right. King Frederick's experiment, right? The German king. So all these things where children died because they weren't connected.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, with all this, right? So no matter how lens we talk about it, really all comes down to what we're talking about tonight.
Yeah, I think it's important too for us to in our time when we are teaching in February to talk about the impact that trauma and traumatic experiences have, as well as sort of just more difficult, more toxic stress experiences, intolerable stress experiences, and how that impacts how we process information, how it impacts how our brains are integrated, how it impacts our relationships. I'm a big fan of Bessel van der Kolk's, work on even looking at how trauma changes how we process visual and auditory information. There's some fairly new science in the last 10 years talking about cortical thinning in response to traumatic experiences, and so how that then impacts how we might, let's say, if you witness domestic violence, your visual cortex may be thinner as an adaptive mechanism to not process as much visual information. And what impact does that have then later in life when you're trying to process visual information of reading your child's facial cues and nonverbal cues? And so I think to kind of weave and sew together some of these different fields in these sciences to talk about all the really hopeful research about how new experiences, particularly these regulated relational experiences, change our brains and change our relationships. I think we'll definitely have a lot of good hopeful stuff to be ending on.
Yeah, that's the positive note of all of this. And two, if there's enough interest, so if people do respond and want to know about ACEs, that's something that I would like to talk about. Yeah. And two, also in the capacity of what ACEs really are. And I think we can get in trouble when we start to worship the ACEs.
The 10 items.
Yes, because
it's so limiting.
Yes. Yeah, so we haven't really defined all the ACEs. We talk about misattunement, right?
Yeah.
What an adverse childhood experiences that is. And it doesn't look at duration, severity, frequency. So there's a big difference too in the ACEs. But in with all the ACEs, you're talking about traumatic fractures of connection without repair.
Yeah, so just in case you aren't familiar with ACEs, it stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It was originally done 17,000 people at Kaiser Permanente in an obesity clinic. And they were really looking at how people's adverse childhood experiences, which I actually wish they hadn't called them adverse childhood experiences. I wish they had called them traumatic. I understand why they didn't, because I think adversity is good for us if we have support, so I think it can be a little bit of a misnomer. But they were really looking at these, there were 10 questions. It was a yes or a no. 5 of them were abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and then there was physical neglect and emotional neglect. So those were 5 of the 10 that they asked about. The other 5 were household dysfunction, like parent with a mental illness, parent with substance abuse, family member incarcerated, witnessing domestic violence, and then separation from parent, like divorce kind of thing. And what they found was that their number, they got a point for each of those, and for the higher their number, the better predictor it was for all these health outcomes.
Morbidities.
Yeah, and now we're looking at beyond health outcomes, but those 10 are just 10. I mean, they don't ask about were you ever in the foster system.
Yes.
Are you, and it's also not looking at community kinds of traumas, like, you know, is there tremendous racism? Is your street a dangerous place? Have you witnessed someone be murdered? I mean,
or born in the
Yeah,
NICU. So
exactly.
Or even how about in utero? So
Right.
mom's going through the difficulty while the child is developing.
But what's important about this is that the traumatic experiences we've had can impact how our brains are wired, how we function in relationships, and this is so great because we know too that when people sort of shine the light of awareness on those and understand them in a new way and move toward healing, we start seeing different outcomes too.
Yes.
So this is really important. But I think it's such important information, and I think too schools are more and more moving towards thinking about being more trauma informed. And I actually recently was at a school that said we're trauma informed, but we're not really, we know it, but we're not doing anything about it. So she talked about, I want to get to where we're trauma sensitive and trauma conscious as opposed to just being trauma informed. And I thought that was kind of really neat to think about.
Yes, that's
that.
awesome. Because it's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear y'all talk more in February, and I'm sure everybody watching is too. We're fixing to wind down our time together, but before we do that, is there anything y'all want to share with our followers about where they can find out more information about your work or any projects or workshops that you have coming up?
You want to start?
So I don't have anything for the public.
Except your great brain and the workshop we're doing together in February.
Yes, but then my great brain comes from your work largely. But so I'm just a humble servant for TJJD and.
So is there any way that folks can stay connected to TJJD as far as
their website
policy changes or anything like that, or
their website, they've actually updated it and they're making it more this Texas model, so it just looks better. It's a less a punitive model, and it's really more of a therapeutic model. And so granted, the outcomes will come, but as changing a state agency, like this is the roadblock that we're up against. And so we've been prepping and getting ready to put this Texas model, which is interpersonal neurobiology, into place. But now you're talking about transforming staff to be attuned, to be, so these are the challenges, but we're getting there.
Awesome.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so just for folks at home, you can head to www.tjjd.texas.gov. And I just pulled up the website, and you're totally right, Scott. This does not look like a state agency website.
Yes.
This is amazing, and it has a lot of stuff of what you just talked about. So
Pretty trees.
yeah, it's pretty trees.
Yeah.
It's illustrated. It's amazing. Awesome. So folks can go there to learn more about the Texas model and some of the work that you're doing, and you're really spearheading there.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Tina, tell us a little bit about what you've got coming up with this new book.
Yep. So easy to find me, TinaBryson.com, and there you'll find the links to my professional Facebook page and Instagram and all that stuff. But one thing I want to make sure and tell you all about, just because it's a promo and you can get a bonus thing, is that if you pre-order The Power of Showing Up, which is the book coming out January 7th, 2020, if you pre-order it now on the website, thepowerofshowingupbook.com, Penguin Random House will send you a beautiful color refrigerator sheet. And you know, in our other books we have these refrigerator sheets at the end, but they're just these little black and white things. But they've made this beautiful colored one, and they'll send that to you. It's two-sided. It's got the 4 S's, and then it's got all the practical strategies for each of the 4 S's. And they'll send that to you if you pre-order before the book comes out. And then I also have a book coming out in fall of 2020 called The Bottom Line for Baby, and I'm really excited about this book.
Wonderful.
I know you read it.
I've read it. It's
I'm
wonderful.
so helpful for to get your input. But it really it's that experience as a parent where you're trying to make a decision about something like, is it okay to let the baby sleep with me or not, or is it okay, can I sleep train, you know, all these questions we have. And it really sort of lays out, for me as a parent, I would read one thing and it would find it really compelling, and then I'd read something else and it was totally the opposite, or I'd get advice from one person and totally different from the next. So what this book does is it takes about 65 of the biggest questions and concerns we have as new parents and lays out kind of the 2 main arguments about whatever the topic is, gives a second section that says, here's what the science says, and then there's a bottom line that really says, Like, for instance, the science is really clear. You should not spank your infant.
Right.
That's really clear in the science, right? So, and then other times it just says, this is a values question, or, here are some things to think about. So anyway, I'm excited about that one as well. It's a different kind of book for me.
Yay. All right. Well, we will definitely be connecting with y'all more in the future. We will be seeing you February 22nd, which is just around the corner. So folks will be sending out our members more information. Stay tuned to our social media channels for more information about that. Dr. Scott LePor, I want to thank you so much for everything that you're doing as a native Texan. I am so jazzed to hear about this Texas model and the impact that it's having on our youth.
I am too.
And Dr. Bryson, thank you so much. You're also a member of our advisory board. And so we at Austin Connection are so thankful for the influence and the knowledge that you've been able to bring to
I'm so proud of the organization.
our team and our members. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad to get work with you and learn from you. It's great.
All right, y'all. Well, I think we're probably going to get some tacos and maybe even some barbecue. But thank you so much for tuning in.